Nichol, and welcome to this introduction to my recent book titled Globalization, Sports Law and Labour Mobility, the Case of Professional Baseball in the United States and Japan. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about my book, what it covers, other than obviously baseball, and basically the different approaches in terms of analytical or theoretical frameworks that I use, and some of the basic aims of the book and what I was trying to achieve in writing this book. So to start off with, the book intersects with a number of different disciplines. So obviously, to start with, that covers the field of sport and specifically baseball. So baseball was chosen essentially because of the restrictive and to some degree complex labor system in Major League Baseball in the United States and Nippon Professional Baseball in Japan. It was also chosen because in terms of globalization, baseball's a little bit different to sports like soccer. Soccer is a truly global sport, and professional leagues exist in many, many countries around the world. So therefore, there's a lot of job opportunities for players to sell their labour. Baseball is much more restricted, and the two largest labour markets in the world are Major League Baseball, followed by Nippon Professional Baseball, so MLB or NPB. So MLB is the highest level competition, followed by NPB. Those two leagues you can make a pretty good living in, especially Major League Baseball, where salaries rise up to $30 million a year, and the base minimum wage is about $560,000 under the collective bargaining agreement. And then under those two leagues, you have leagues like the Korean Baseball Organization, the Taiwanese Baseball League, the CPBL, and then there's a group of Latin American leagues as well. There's a couple of leagues in Mexico, the Dominican Republic, Venezuela, Cuba, but essentially the highest level of competition and also salary is MLB, as I mentioned, and then NPB. So in terms of regulation, what I do with this book is look at how labour is regulated by Major League Baseball and also Nippon Professional Baseball. And that essentially comes within the regulatory system of baseball for labour and expanding upon that sport. And so obviously within sport, there's different regulatory models and approaches to regulation, depending on whether you're Olympic or non-Olympic sport. Baseball is essentially a non-Olympic sport, which is an important differentiation from soccer and other leagues that fall within, say, the IOC model of regulation, as well as the Court of Arbitration for Sport and the World Anti-Doping Authority, which MLB and NPB do not comply with. They have their own PED anti-doping systems under their collective bargaining agreements in each country. So in terms of regulation, I go beyond the standard approach of law school and saying legislation and common law and rules of equity, at least in common law countries, are law. So I expand beyond just law to look at other forms of regulation and how these laws that are contained in, say, contract law, competition law, and also employment law basically interact with and shape the self-regulation of baseball. Because historically sport and in particular baseball in both Japan and the US self-regulate. And particularly in recent years, you see greater interaction with government laws and regulation. And you also see a significant increase in when the state is prepared to regulate sport. And that varies between places like Australia, where I live, and also Japan, the US, Europe, and other parts of the world. And so I also, in terms of the framework for regulation, look at different forms of regulation. As I mentioned, legislation, there might be the rules contained by Major League Baseball, it might be the labour controls, things like the draft, trading, free agency, and the player transfer system between MLB and NPB. And so this also incorporates regulatory actors. Who are the regulatory actors? Major League Baseball, player associations. You also looking at NPB, and also is there a global sports governing body? What's the role of the courts when labour controls in sport are challenged? And also another body is obviously parliaments. They can play a very important role in oversight, particularly in recent decades of what sports do or don't do, and the period known as the doping era, the steroid era in Major League Baseball in the 1990s through the early 2000s was broken in part, the lack of regulation in that league. It was broken in part because of the oversight of Congress and their threats to legislate if Major League Baseball didn't impose appropriate forms of regulation. There's also a comparative law element. So obviously looking at Japan and the US, as you would see in the book if you read that, but basically what you have is two very similar labour systems of labour regulation, but they operate very, very differently. And free agency is really a good example of that, in that in terms of free agency, there's a lot of players that elect to become free agents in the US, primarily because of the money that can be made and the long-term deals, tens of millions of dollars, ranging these days up to hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. Whereas the salary disparity between the best player and the lowest skilled player, the paid player, is much lower in Japan. The highest paid player is about sort of $3 to $5 million. There aren't a lot of those players, and then the lowest paid player is around about $100,000, a little bit less for development players on the Ikusei roster. And so it's quite interesting to look at how not only the systems of regulation operate, but also the labour laws, the collective bargaining rules, the collective bargaining processes. The collective bargaining agreement in Major League Baseball is quite long. It's a few hundred pages, whereas it's only a few pages in Japan. And so they also have workplace rules, which can be negotiated between the employer and the employees. So again, this is another really interesting difference that you find between labour regulation in Japan and other countries such as the US. And again, people like me from Australia find significant differences like that. And so the last discipline or area is really globalization. So what I look at is how has globalization changed the labour market in Major League Baseball, and how has it changed the labour market in Nippon professional baseball? And primarily, the big change is that baseball players can play in any country around the world now. And so in Major League Baseball, they've embraced globalization since really the breakdown of segregation in America and in Major League Baseball. When Jackie Robinson broke the colour barrier in the 1940s, that allowed non-white players, people of colour in Latin America, to play in the minor leagues and the major leagues. The minor leagues are controlled essentially by major league clubs. The players are contracted by major league clubs and assigned to the minor leagues if they don't make the major league roster. And then that eventually led to Asian players, starting with Japanese players and Hideo Nomo in the 1990s after Murakami's brief appearance for the San Francisco Giants in the 1960s led to the first posting agreement in the mid-1960s, and essentially no player from Japan played in the major leagues until Nomo in the mid-90s with the Dodgers. And so that's very interesting in terms of the effect of globalization, and that Major League Baseball has about 30% foreign players in 2021. And then in Japan, it's the exact opposite approach in terms of a protectionist approach to preserve jobs for Japanese players, but also, I think, in part, to preserve the Japaneseness, what Japanese people consider to be the unique qualities of Japanese baseball as well. So that intersects with things like culture and sociology and society and these types of things as well. Is quite interesting with Japanese baseball and some of the features of Japanese baseball that people like Robert Whiting and others have written extensively on. In terms of what the book is focusing on, the research problem, the question, it's essentially the ability of an athlete to freely sell his or her labour. And as I mentioned, I chose baseball because it's a highly restrictive labour market, or labour regulation. And that started by Major League Baseball, or back then it was the National League, National League of Professional Baseball, in the late 1800s. And then Major League Baseball essentially became the American League and the National League in the early 1900s. You have the first World Series. And there's been challenges by players since the 1880s, 1870s to the reserve system, which led to free agency. So it's been a long fight in sports like baseball for players to be able to freely sell their labour to any team within Major League Baseball and also Nippon Professional Baseball, because they basically adopted Major League Baseball's approach to labour and still do to some degree. And basically, players have had to fight for things like free agency over a number of years through collective bargaining and industrial action in the US in particular. And so it's really, I think, quite important to look at this issue, because a baseball player in the current system, like other sports, is drafted. They have to play for that team or sit out a year and wait to the next draft. When they're drafted, that player must sign a contract with that team under the rules set by the league. In Major League Baseball draft, the minor league players agreed to a 7-year contract where the minimum wages are set throughout the league, through every team. Now, there's major competition law issues there that the book looks at. And then the other related issue to this is that players can be released, particularly in Major League Baseball, at any point, in any time, for any reason. They can be traded at any point or any time. Now, these things exist in Japan as well. It doesn't operate as harshly as what does in the Major League and minor league system in the US, but those rules are there as well. And so this is really important, because the major leagues have a labour market of a little over 750 players now with the post-COVID changes. And the minor leagues were just reduced from the 2020 to 21 season from 7,500 players. It was reduced by 25%. And there's no collective bargaining agreement in the minor leagues or union for the minor leagues. So there's some very, very interesting labour law issues and I think society issues. Why can young athletes as young as 16 be signed by a professional baseball team in the US, 18 in Japan, and basically have very, very few rights to negotiate the best possible salary and the length of the contract and the terms of the agreement? They're standardised player contracts. So players are really locked in for most of their young adult life to that one club. They have, even though there's player representation, there's still limited ability of those players. Now, it's much, much better than, say, the 1960s and 1970s for players. The salaries are better, the working conditions are much better, but there's still some inherent problems. And so I think it's really important that we discuss these things and we look at these issues. The other point that I explore is labour mobility. So what is labour mobility in terms of labour law scholarship? And then how does baseball fit within that? And then I expand that out to look at global labour mobility, essentially through the movement of players from Japanese baseball to American baseball and major league teams. And then I also sort of flip it over to look at foreign players going to MPB. And this is really interesting, and this may be an update, second edition of the book, possibly here, because since my book was published, the posting agreement between Major League Baseball and Nippon Professional Baseball has basically been used and replicated, a revised one in 2017. It's been used by Major League Baseball with the other major professional leagues. So you have a quasi system of global player transfers. And so in terms of theory, I've mentioned some of the theory, but in terms of regulatory theory, I adopt autopoietic theory, regulatory theory, which basically states that the regulatory system of law is a self-contained regulatory system, like economic systems or political systems. And so I adopt that to baseball to say, well, you have the sport regulatory model, and then within that you have individual sports and individual sports in individual leagues. So I look at the autopoietic regulatory system of Major League Baseball and compare that to Nippon Professional Baseball. And then the other things that I look at is, well, what is regulation, as I mentioned earlier. I particularly like responsive regulation, which is how regulators, say in this case Major League Baseball and MPB, react and respond to what happens within that regulatory system. And then I also like to divide between the internal regulation of baseball labour and how that interacts and engages with the external regulation of labour, say through courts, foreign leagues, regulatory bodies at a global level. It's not a big thing in sport, like say with FIFA and soccer, and also internal and external forms of regulation. And again, how these internal and external systems interact and engage. And essentially focus on certain events in Major League Baseball and Nippon Professional Baseball, and how that influences the long-term regulation of labour in those leagues and in the sport more broadly. I also look at labour law and approaches, and responsive regulation has sort of been modified in labour scholarship, labour law scholarship, to be reflexive labour law. And I also focus on the principle that labour is not a commodity. That's a key theme of my book. And essentially what I argue is that athletes in baseball are commodified, that they're treating it as commodities in terms of their autonomy and their ability to control their labour and sell their labour freely within, say, Japan and also on global labour markets. In terms of law, as I mentioned, I look at the labour controls and practices of baseball in both Japan and the US in terms of contract law, labour law, and competition law to determine their legality. And I explore a number of cases, particularly in the US, and there's a much smaller number of baseball cases in Japan, but I also look at the case in 2000s that focused on the first and only player strike in Japanese baseball. And then lastly, as I mentioned, in terms of theory, there's an underlying theory of globalization. And I'll just finish my brief introduction here by just going through the structure of the book. So I sort of have an extended introduction through 2 chapters. So the first chapter is introduction, where I'll just go through the basic objectives and aims of the book. And then I extend that introduction in chapter 2 through an overview of professional baseball in the United States and Japan, and just go through the basics of labour and labour regulation in both not only baseball, but in Major League Baseball and Nippon Professional Baseball. I then send out a theoretical chapter that explores the principle that labour is not a commodity in terms of international law, the theories of this principle, and also how it's embedded in American law. Then I go through another theoretical chapter on what is regulation and regulatory theory, and what is labour regulation and approaches to labour law. Then I go through the internal regulatory actors and mechanisms in professional baseball in both MLB and NPB. And then I look at the external regulatory actors and mechanisms in these two leagues. And I go through the different labour controls, both within baseball and also externally, and also the impact of the regulatory actors in the operation of these two regulatory systems. Then I set out in Chapter 8 a legal concept of labour mobility. And then in Chapter 8, I provide a modified or adapted version of labour mobility for the purposes of professional baseball. Chapter 9, I then go through how labour in professional baseball has been commodified and essentially how over a number of decades, primarily through unionisation in both leagues, that level of commodification has gradually decreased. Now, I don't argue that baseball's a slave, as Kurt Flood did in his court action in the 1970s, argue that he was a slave. It was dropped for the Supreme Court case, but I don't go that far. But I also don't go as far to say that baseball players have the autonomy and control over their labour that you or I do in non-sports markets. And so I sort of argue essentially that baseball is a commodified, and the level of commodification really depends on the league, the country, and the point in time. I finish off by setting out a potential framework for a new global player transfer system. I'll look at some other sports like basketball, soccer, and ice hockey, and just propose a basic framework for how a global player transfer system could operate in the sport of baseball. And I think this is quite an important thing to do as Major League Baseball is embarking on a fairly aggressive globalization process, and things like the World Baseball Classic has become very popular, and baseball is becoming more and more accessible outside Japan and the US and the other big baseball countries in Asia and Latin America, essentially because of streaming services. In the 1990s, you could only watch Major League Baseball in Australia at 10 o'clock at night, a replay game. Now you can watch it live on cable sports. You can also watch live games on the internet through various streaming services. So baseball is becoming more globalized, more popular, which hopefully means more people play baseball. And that then leads to greater issues in terms of the regulation of professional players and also amateur players, which is maybe the topic of future research. So thank you, and I hope that you enjoy the world of sports law and baseball law.